Would you please come up and join me, and please would you give him a warm welcome.
Thanks, Mark. Shall I move this out of the way?
Oh yes,
There you go.
Thank you very much. So I'm so glad you came to do front of
It's all
house.
right, yeah. Being a roadie.
Now, Tim doesn't need much introducing, I suspect, most of you, but by way of a very quick summary, he's been the Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament for Westmoreland and Lonsdale in Cumbria, that is, since 2005. He's been President of the Liberal Democrats between 2011 and 2014, and he was leader of the party 2015 to 2017. Now, Tim, before you speak to us, we'd all love to just hear a bit more about you, your background, how you got into politics, etc. So, can you start by telling us a bit about your family and your childhood?
Okay, right. Well, I was born in Preston in 1970. England was still world champions for the following fortnight. It all went downhill after that. My parents were lovely people, and my mum is no longer with us, sadly, but my dad gladly is. They split up when I was 5. They were very young, they were only 20 when they got married. I wasn't churched in any way. I have a little sister who's in New Zealand these days, Jo, I'm very close with, and a younger brother who is also a Blackburn Rovers fan, as I am. And it's all my fault, because I came home from university in 1992, and he was showing signs of being a Manchester United fan. And I invested all my spare income, and I was single and just got my first job, so it was reasonable in those days, in taking to every game. And that was when we were good. And now I've plunged him into a lifetime of misery, and it's all my fault.
Let's just stay on Blackburn Rovers for a moment.
Oh, yes.
Because you grew up in Preston.
Yeah.
So how come? How come Blackburn Rovers?
Family. Family were in Blackburn, Darwin, which is the kind of slightly posh end of Blackburn, if you know it. And in Blackpool, and in Bolton, and in Preston, and in Southport. And the Southport lot, they're kind of posh Scousers if you're in Southport. They all supported Liverpool. The Blackpool family supported Blackpool. The Bolton family supported Bolton Wanderers. The Preston family's a bit mixed, because half of them had been from Darwin, so they were sort of half Blackburn, half Preston. And the Darwin crowd supported Blackburn, and the difference was the Darwin crowd were my glamorous older cousins, and they actually went to matches. The Liverpool, the Preston, the Blackpool and the Bolton fans just watched it from the sofa, and the Rovers fans went to games. And I would go up to Boxing Day at my Auntie Kiva's house in Darwin, and back would come my Uncle Derek and my cousins Simon and Michael, looking flushed, full of the game, Bay City Rollers haircuts and rattles and scarves. I thought, I want a piece of that, and that is how I'm a Blackburn Rovers fan. Tell us, how does being a Liberal Democrat, a fan of indie music, and a Blackburn Rovers fan, how do those things join together? Well, I think they demonstrate a person who's a born loser and who quite enjoys it.
Moving swiftly on. Some people may not know that you actually won Celebrity Mastermind in the last few years, and I'd like to know how your life has changed since you won Celebrity Mastermind.
I think the lives of everybody who comes across me has changed because I tell them. But otherwise, it's the only thing I've ever won. I'm just thinking if it is. Yeah, no. On my mantelpiece, actually, it's on the kitchen sort of windowsill. I have got 2 trophies. I've got the Celebrity Mastermind trophy, and I also have another trophy, which was given me, but I didn't really earn. And it was when I did the 2009 Coniston Old Man Fell race. And if you know it, it's 3 miles up, 3 miles down, and it's 2,500 feet in ascent. And the winner does it in 52 minutes. It took me 59 minutes just to get to the top. When I got down as the MP, I was asked to do presenting of the awards. So, best 3 women, best 3 men, and then, of course, all the kind of age categories, the veterans, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And when it got to women over 70s, there were no women in the race, so they gave it me. So you are looking at the 2009 fastest woman over 70, and that's still on the mantelpiece.
And I believe you've been approached for a number of other quite high-profile TV appearances.
Yes, I have.
On the back of that.
Well, I mean, I was asked to do Celebrity Dancing on Ice, which, of course, is, a second-rate strictly, and I was asked to do The Island with Bear Grylls, which is a second-rate I'm a Celebrity. So we've gathered a picture now that I'm the kind of person who gets asked on second-rate celebrity programmes, and I turned them both down because I didn't think it would go down well with the Westminster Gazette.
Okay, let's get serious.
Yes.
What got you into politics?
Well, it's same with Christianity, and we'll talk about that later on, that the danger is you end up getting very neat and polished with your testimonies. And the reality is we all kind of fall into the things we fall into in slightly more chaotic fashions and, the neat stories we tell people. But essentially, I guess two or three things. One is I remember as a child growing up, as a teenager in the 80s, there were kind of two unifying televisual events every week. And one of them was Top of the Pops, Thursday nights. You come in on a Friday morning, did you see? Everybody had seen, and had that shared experience. And the other, bizarrely, was Spitting Image on a Sunday night. So you come in on Monday morning doing impressions of the people doing impressions of the politicians. And they were a very colourful set of politicians in those days, as you might imagine. And so there was an awareness of politics. It was interesting, it was colourful. But I think the thing that actually politicised me rather than me thinking it was interesting was that I watched Cathy Come Home by mistake when I was 14. I say by mistake because one of the reasons why there were unifying televisual events was that there were only 3 or 4 channels. I think Channel 4 came about around 1983, 84, but there were only 3 or 4 channels, and we didn't have a remote control, and I was sat in the setting room on my own, and it was on. And I couldn't be bothered to get up and switch it off. And after about 5 or 10 minutes, it completely gripped me. If you don't know the story, it's obviously based on true stories. It's made in 1966, a very gritty Ken Loach film, and it's about a woman called Cathy, a husband called Derek, I think, and their lives spiral downwards through a series of misfortunes, ill health, lost jobs, losing a tenancy. They split up. And it ends. It's horrific. It's her end with her having the children taken off her on a park bench by social services, and she screams, "You're not having my kids," as the credits roll, and it made me cry. It still makes me cry to think about it. And so I got involved in politics because something made me cry, and I went down to the post office in the little place I lived near Preston the following day with 3 weeks pocket money, which would have normally gone on a Smith single, but it instead went on a postal order. Kids, I'll tell you what one of those is later. But a postal order, and I joined Shelter, the campaign for the homeless. And a couple of years later, I just happened to be at sixth form in my first week at a big sixth form college in Leyland in Lancashire, because none of the schools around our neck of the woods had sixth form, so we all went to this one place. And there was the Liberal Society stall, and I thought, yeah, I'm one of them. It's all right having, being concerned about one issue, about housing and homelessness, but there's a range of things we should have opinions on, and we should try to, we should have a view across the piece. Even at 16, I was aware that I hadn't made the best career choice, but I just felt, I am a Liberal, I'll join them.
You're well known as a Christian, so I'd love to just hear a bit about that. How did you become a Christian in the first place?
Well, again, I mean, in church circles, the danger is that we kind of venerate the testimony. And it's almost as though if you haven't been gun running and been on heroin, your story's not worth listening to, And the quietest, gentlest testimony, where your parents take you to church and you put your faith in Christ as a child, that's great. That is great. So my story's sort of somewhere in the middle. And it is that I was brought up by a very lovely family, but not to go to church. My dad, a very important part of our life, but we didn't live with him. We lived with my mum, who was your typical small L Guardian Liberal, and who, she'd refer to herself as the nouveau poor. So we know the nouveau riche, loads of cash, no class. My mum was the exact opposite. And so, she struggled effectively as a single mum, but filled in me a really healthy sense of scepticism, quite a British thing really, to be quite cynical about anybody who's too keen about anything. So you can be you can have opinions, you can join things, but don't overdo it. So, so there's a real reluctance, I think, to, and she was the person I think who was probably most offended by me becoming a Christian. So it came about largely because of a thing that happened to my mum. So I was, if you'd asked me at sort of 16, 17, 18, was I a Christian? It's a different era, it's 30 odd years ago now. I probably would have shrugged and said, yeah, because I'm English, aren't I? And maybe we wouldn't say that today. But it certainly wasn't a considered faith at all, if it was even a faith at all. There was a guy I was at sixth form with, Jack, who was the drummer in a much better band than I was in. They were actually half good. We were dismissed as a fourth-rate New Order, and that was overstating how good we were. But he was the college Christian. I'm sure he wasn't the only one, but he was the one who stood out. And he stood out because he was a lovely guy, but we thought his faith, and I thought his faith was kind of weird, restrictive, unattractive, probably not true. I didn't give it much thought at all. But his life and his lifestyle was challenging. I won't say attractive, but it was challenging, and it intrigued me. Anyhow, I came home from sixth form one day in upper sixth, into the sort of, probably this time of year, so bearing down on A-levels. And my mum, who by this point was now a lecturer at what we now call the University of Central Lancashire, but was then Preston Poly, and she came home with the news that her and about a third of the department were going to be seconded to this new college in Singapore. I thought, oh, that's interesting. I'd only been abroad once in my life before then. That was for a week in Ibiza when I was 12. Not clubbing, don't worry. Anyway, so cut a long story short, off went my mum. Lots of friends we knew through the college. Me and my sister, who was 16, I was 18, after my A-levels. And we got plonked in a house that belonged to the college, and the previous tenants had been college staff, academics, who were Christians. Now, we knew nothing about that at all at the time. What we did discover was that the college had made a mistake in thinking that my mum and the guy who was, billeted with us were a couple, and they weren't. And so as a result, we were one room short. So they emptied the box room of all the junk that the previous tenants had in it, everything except a bed and the bookshelves. And that was mine, because I was going home first to get my A-level results, so I got the worst room, and I was cool with it, really. And it rains a lot in Singapore, and I only brought about 100 quid with me, and there's only so much time I wanted to spend with my sister, so I ended up, I brought one book with me, and it was Darkness at Noon by Arthur Koestler, which is flipping miserable. Great book, but utterly miserable. So I ended up reading these books on the shelves, and I started off reading the A.A. Milne books again. So I read all the Winnie the Pooh back catalogue because I was resisting this weird God stuff that was there. And the first book I picked up was called I Once Loved a Girl. Brackets, me and my mates ripped it off as a song title because it sounded good. The title's good, the song's terrible. But it was all about sexual ethics. And I thought, literally threw it back on the shelf. Don't tell me what I can and can't do. And put that away. In the days later, I ended up reading stuff that I think you and I would probably call apologetics, defences of the reasonableness of the Christian faith. And to cut a very long story short, at some point in the early hours one night, when I was 18 in Singapore, it hit me almost with a physical force. Oh, flippin' heck, it's true. It's true. So I put my trust in Jesus that night, and I won't say I've not looked back, because it's been lots of ups and downs, including a period of time in my 20s where I was fully backslidden. But that's how I became a Christian. I don't think I was looking to become one. I think I was resistant. I think I was reluctant. I thought the evidence was overwhelming, and I still do.
How does your Christianity and your politics, how do they relate?
Well, again, not a neat testimony, really, because I got involved in politics before I became a Christian. And I interviewed for my podcast, plug, this morning, a guy called Darren Miller. Some of you might have come across. He's a Conservative member of the Senate in Wales.
Give us the name of the podcast.
It's called A Mucky Business, and I'll tell you why it is in a minute. And Darren, it was a real relief to interview Darren, because he had a similar story to me, in that he got involved in politics first before becoming a Christian. Lots of Christians in politics kind of feel called to go into it as Christians. I kind of think that's the honourable, that's the right, that's the neat way of doing it. But for me, it was much more, I became a Christian after having got involved in politics. And unlike Darren, by the way, who very much kind of decided, well, politics is just too small beer, and now I've become a Christian, now I've discovered this big thing. I didn't really, I just kept going. And I recall maybe 2-3 months into my time at university, being at a Navigators event, so kind of Christian Union style thing, in or near my hall of residence, and there was a guy who I knew, he just came up to me and he said, why are you involved in politics, Tim? It's a mucky business. It's a mucky business for a Christian to be involved in. And, we'll perhaps talk about this more later, but I think the answer, it is a mucky business, but so is everything else since the fall, and I don't think we're called to be hermits. And so falteringly is the relationship between a Christian and in politics, just like it is in every other walk of life. Loads of errors made, seeking to serve. And I think as the years have gone by, certainly since I became... I was very clear as a newly elected MP that my job was kind of not to legislate to make people who are not Christians live as though they were, but to use my profile to be open about my faith so that people who are not Christians might hear the gospel. In more recent times, I think that ever more. I also think politics is a form of service, and it's also a mission field. It's an opportunity to serve the community that you've been given stewardship of in my neck of the woods, for example, and more broadly. But politics is full of people who are searching for meaning, who are looking for answers, and their motives are mixed, just like all of ours. Our motives are mixed for lots of different things, and there's an opportunity to meet them in a place of real need, and sometimes, hopefully, to share the gospel with them.
Final question before we go this. Ukraine is at the forefront of all of our minds at the moment. I wonder if you could help us. How should we think about it politically? I know it's a very broad question, but also how should we think about it as Christians as well?
Well, look, in the broadest sense, I'm going to observe that, and I'm going to say Liberal Democrat now with a small L and a small d, referring to kind of the post-war kind of Western consensus. I think we've been really complacent about Western liberal democracy in recent decades. And complacent in two ways. One sense, militarily. The fact that we've just assumed the peace dividend post-1990 was a thing which was a given, and we have now the smallest army we've had for 200 years in this country, standing army. So we've ceased to, in any muscular way, defend Western liberal democracy. But we've also ceased to defend it in principle, in theory, and believe in it. And you can count me as, in the broadest sort of moderatist sense, but nevertheless as part of the left, if you like. I think the left and the right are equally responsible, but in different ways. Particularly post 9/11 and post Iraq, especially. People on the left have been too lazy in their blanket criticism of the West, to the extent that they'll make common cause with people who think despicable things that are clearly not progressive in the slightest. And on the right, you've got people who will lionize the likes of Putin, partly because they think it winds up the liberals, and partly because actually there is a Christian nationalism there. One of the things that Western commentators have missed in all of Putin's wickedness is actually that he's a Christian nationalist. Listen to his rhetoric. The being joined at the hip with Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. Kiev is the home of the Russian Orthodox Church. This is why it's important, and this is about reaffirming kind of Christian values against this decadent liberal West. If you listen to the rhetoric, which the media are not picking up on, that's every bit as important as regaining Russia's historic territories and sphere of influence. So if we don't understand that, we're going to get run rings around. And so, to slightly paraphrase Winston Churchill, that liberal democracy is totally and utterly flawed. There's loads wrong with it. But by gum, it's better than all the alternatives. And so I think, if nothing else, this might make us understand how valuable our freedoms are. And by the way, as Christians, let's remember that much of what we call Western liberal democracy completely owes its roots to a Christian worldview. Tom Holland obviously is a great person to read if you want to try and understand a bit more about that. But as somebody else wise once said, Western liberal democracy bears the crater marks of the gospel. Because belief in equality, of justice, these things are not naturally occurring beliefs in many systems around the world. But they are in Western liberal democracies. Why? Because they were underpinned, at least, by a Christian worldview. So, but when it comes down to the awful things in Ukraine, what do we do as Christians? Well, people will tweet thoughts and prayers. You should pray. If we believe in a God who is the Lord of the universe, we're not praying to somebody who is impotent in this, but a God who is utterly, utterly involved. And, the Bible gives us plenty of good examples of the kind of prayers we might pray at times like these. And they should be angry prayers. They should be prayers of real serious lament, as we see in Lamentations, in the Psalms. You should be calling upon God, almost banging your fist on the table. What are you doing? The reality is we know that he will be doing good because he works all things for the good, but goodness me, it doesn't look like it sometimes.
Tim, thank you. This has been great. That's a great start, and it'd be great to come back to many of those threads in questions afterwards. But I'd love you to take the lectern.
Right, I will. Yeah.
Again.
Not that I've got much of a. I scribbled down some notes. So the thing, the virtue of this kind of a talk is that goodness knows how long it might go on for. This could be 3 minutes. We could be here this time tomorrow. There's a great tale, isn't there, about a vicar who dreamt he was giving a sermon and he woke up to discover that he was. So that might be it. The other favourite story, it never happens here. I'm sure it doesn't. Well, A late, great parliamentary colleague of mine who will remain nameless once went to an event in his constituency when he was an MP, a Women's Institute lunch, and by his own admission he went on a bit. And as he was escorted to his car after the event by the secretary of this WI branch, she said, "Thanks so much for coming, Mr. Ashdown. Oops. Do come again when you have less time." So I'll do that. So look, I think I just want to. So why bother with Christianity? I'm going to start by saying it's true, which sounds terribly dogmatic. Of course, it's terribly dogmatic. But look, let's start with a big philosophical question: Is there a God? I don't know if that troubles people every day, whether people think about it. Or my sense is that if we examine worldviews that are available, abject nihilism, the belief there's no God and no meaning to anything, we're all total accidents, it's a horrible worldview in so many ways. But actually I think it's the only other, I would argue, intellectually consistent worldview than that there's a God. Everything else, we're just kidding ourselves. If you think there's meaning in your life and there's no God, there isn't. We're here for a temporary period of time. Everything we do, everything we say is rendered meaningless. We're on a planet that's, revolving around a star that's got, 5 billion years left. Actually, we're only going to be habitable for another 800 million years. Humanity will go out extinct at some point before that. The sun will dissolve the Earth. The sun itself will crunch into some white dwarf. It will eventually just snuff out altogether. The universe will just cease to have any kind of substance whatsoever. Nobody will ever know you're ever here. Your life is totally and utterly meaningless. That is a miserable point of view, but it is intellectually consistent, and I'd argue it's the only other intellectually consistent worldview other than the belief in a creator, in a God. So, okay, you believe in God, Tim. Why this one? There's all these tons of gods and worldviews. You call yourself a liberal. How dogmatic that you think it's this particular God. Well, look, the first thing I want to say is this. There have been however many billions of people have walked the earth over the last however many years. And only in that time, many different worldviews, many different faith positions and all the rest of it, in that time, only one person has claimed to be the God of the universe and been taken seriously for any length of time by any number of people. Only one. Remember all the other kind of truth claims, all the other claims of of religious truth, and it's not that we dismiss those, but none of those people have claimed seriously for any length of time to be God himself, and I am including David Icke in that. And the reality is then that Jesus' claim is really staggeringly unique. So, where would I start if I'm going to work out whether there's a God or not? Well, this might sound terribly simplistic, but it kind of works on me. And it's this: if Jesus Christ rose from the dead, if he is who he says he is, then there is a God, we know his name, and you can stop the search. Call it off. End of search. And so I think you would say that, yes, okay, that's your view, but how dogmatic, how extreme? Why do I have to tolerate that kind of extremist, that kind of exclusive kind of world view? I'd argue that even if you're somebody who believes in a kind of mushy, small L kind of liberal theology, or some kind of view that all roads lead to God, or something very inclusive like that, I'm sorry, that is also an exclusive point of view, because you're excluding all those people who have faith positions that are exclusive. So there is no soft, easy option here. Every worldview is exclusive one way or another. I'm arguing that the Christian worldview, or more importantly, the Christian founder, is the one that you cannot ignore. You can't turn your back on. You can't write him off. So, we've all heard of or many of us will have heard of C.S. Lewis's trilemma. Who is Jesus Christ? He's Lord, liar, or lunatic. And maybe you haven't heard that. And the case that Lewis makes, again, another far brainier, reluctant convert, one who was an atheist and then describes himself as the most reluctant of converts. He talks about how, to an extent, we kind of look at Jesus, this is not language he would have used, as some kind of nice hippie, a kind of philosopher, a guy who says some nice things to help us with our lives, a good man, a man worthy of following, but come on, he's not God. And the simple observation that Lewis makes is that somebody who makes the claims Jesus did cannot be that kind of a person. And that means we've just got to take the time. The Gospels are not long, by the way. You'd read through all 4 of them in 2 or 3 hours. So there's no excuse for not looking at the real Jesus and the things he said. And they're crazy. They're amazing. They are not what many people would assume. So I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. I mean, there's nothing vague about that. This is a claim he talks about before Abraham was, I am. I am. He knew, this is a very religiously literate audience who were listening to him. They knew exactly what he meant. He was claiming to be God Almighty before Abraham. There's no question at all that this man was making ludicrous, hugely, almost egotistical claims about who he was. And what he'd come to do. So, yes, he welcomes the little children to come to him. Yes, he healed lepers. Yes, he did all these lovely things that people like to hear that Jesus did. But he also made these astonishing truth and personal claims. He claimed to be the God of the universe and the judge of the universe and the saviour of all humankind. Now, as Lewis says, somebody who makes those claims is either lying, in which case he's an evil, wicked man, don't follow him, or he's a lunatic, I think, on a level of somebody who claims they're a fried egg, I think is what C.S. Lewis says. So he thinks he's God, but come on, he's not. Or he is the Lord of all. You think, wow. Now, in recent times, I've heard people say, yeah, Lord, liar, lunatic, what about legend? What about legend? So it might say those things in the Bible we've got today. But look, it's been twisted over generations, over many, many centuries. Well, if our earliest existing copies of the New Testament were, 600 years after the events that happened, and by the way, and I'll say this very gently, but the Islamic account of Jesus' life were written 600 years after the events, then yes, okay, you could take them with a pinch of salt. But the reality is that the New Testament documents are a collection of eyewitness accounts written within the lifetime of people who knew Jesus and were indeed people who knew Jesus. We've got something like 20,000 existing manuscript copies of the New Testament documents. And they're copies, yeah, but they are massively, remarkably consistent, which bears testimony to them being drawn from a single set of consistent earlier original script. And, in Manchester we've got a copy of, I think, John's Gospel, 140. AD. We're looking at, even atheistic scholars will generally speaking now accept that an earlier and earlier authorship date of most of the New Testament documents. Galatians, for example, probably written within 20 years, if not less, of Jesus' death. Now, a month ago we celebrated, brackets, I celebrated, the 20th anniversary of Blackburn Rovers winning the League Cup. Annoyingly at the Millennium Stadium in Cardiff, which is a wonderful stadium, but annoyingly it wasn't Wembley. But we beat Spurs, sorry to any Spurs fans, 2-1. I can tell you, without any reference to any notes I made on the day, that it was 2-1, that Matt Jansen and Andy Cole scored for us in the 20th minute and the 67th minute. I can tell you that my 5-month-old baby daughter woke up when Andy Cole scored the winner. I can tell you that I patted David Dunn on the back as he did the lap of honour, and I said the immortal words, "Well done, Dunny." I can tell you I got back in at 5 o'clock in the morning up into the Lake District and had to be at a meeting in Lancaster University at 9 o'clock in the morning, but it was made a bit sweeter because the chair was a sociology professor who was a Spurs fan. So I can, look, like yesterday, if you met somebody who claimed to be the Son of God and you spent 3 years with him, I'm going to say your testimony written within 20 years is pretty blinking reliable. So legend is not an option to you. If you are hoping to hide behind the fuzziness of ancient tomes and we just can't be sure, I'm sorry, that route is not open to you. It is not open to you. And this might seem far too black and white, and there's people who are a lot brighter and probably more scholarly than me in here, but I think the conclusion is that you look at the New Testament document, you look at why they're written, you look at the first few verses of Luke where Luke says, "I am writing this to you, Theophilus, so that you may know the truth of the things that you have been taught." John says towards the end of his account, these things have been written so that you may know that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and by believing in him you may have life in his name. So it's very clear why these things were written. This was not a general reflection, not a nice account, not a neutral article. These are polemic but first-hand eyewitness accounts seeking to persuade you that Jesus is the Son of God, and by believing in him you may have life in his name. I'm afraid the only conclusion I think you can draw is that either this is the most elaborate and wicked hoax in the whole of history, deliberate, or it's true. I do not think there's a third option. I don't think there's a credible third option. You can cleave to it if you wish. I just don't think it stands any scrutiny whatsoever. And there's a reason why people stick to the third option as much as possible. So I said I backslid in my 20s, early 30s. And I was on holiday when I first began to unbackslide. And I read, oddly enough, Cosmos by Carl Sagan, which, I love Carl Sagan, God rest him. He's a guy who was an atheist, so I don't know if God is resting him, but he was a remarkable man, and he was, if you like, the human face of NASA. Really kind of almost like the American Brian Cox of the 70s and 80s. He's a real hero of mine. And so I remember watching the programme that he did, that Cosmos was the book of, years and years beforehand. But I read this book on holiday when I was 32, and I had, this was the same year that Blackburn had won the League Cup, so Grady was 11 months by that stage. And everyone was in bed. I was reading Cosmos. I read the whole book in an evening. And obviously it's talking about human beings' exploration of the solar system, both physically but in our understanding of it over the centuries. And he keeps returning to the theme in this book, at least it felt like it to me, that Christianity in particular, religion in general, just had held us back. It occurred to me that I didn't think that. I hadn't stopped living as a Christian because I agree with Carl Sagan, that I disagree with Christianity. I'd stopped living as a Christian because it was inconvenient. And that is intellectually impossible to sustain. And so, not immediately, but in the weeks that followed, I rededicated myself to following Jesus. I bumped into a couple of friends I knew who were coming out of a hall in Kendal. I was on my way into a Lib Dem executive meeting, and they were on their way out from a table tennis event. And I said, you guys are Christians, aren't you? And they said, yeah. I said, I think I'm unbacksliding. And so very grateful for the people who get put in your life. I don't want to go on forever and ever, so I just want to say a couple of things about Christianity, just to kind of give you a little bit more hope that this is a thing that you should take very, very seriously. I mean, I don't think you'd make it up. First of all, Christianity you wouldn't make up, and you wouldn't make it up for a whole bunch of reasons. One of which is that, you know, you wouldn't have the heroes being such ridiculous characters. I mean, given who wrote the New Testament documents, who are, you know, largely people who have been around Jesus and either were disciples or were friends of disciples, you know, you wouldn't have the disciples as such a bunch of, you know, two-faced losers, spineless, you know, cowards, all sorts of terrible events. You know, Jesus denying Christ, Thomas denying that he'd been risen from the dead, all of those things that, you know, many, many other examples throughout the New Testament documents and in the Gospels in particular. You wouldn't have your heroes being such complete and utter failures if you were making it up. Neither would you have the cross as your symbol, or would you have the cross as the foundation. And the more I think about it, you think about what the cross meant at that time, and obviously an agonizing way to die, but it was a sign of absolute and total subjugation. Even the most appalling Roman citizen could not be crucified because it was a shameful thing, an abysmal, shameful thing. A shameful thing that, you know, where your excruciating agony is displayed for all to see. Not only am I punishing you, not only am I killing you, I am ridiculing you to your last breath. That is what the empire was saying to anybody who was a victim of crucifixion. And it's many, 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 many years, generations, if not hundreds of years, after that event that the cross actually got used any kind of symbol for Christian faith, because it was such a thing of shame. You wouldn't have your king, your saviour, killed upon a cross. But I'll tell you the other thing that you wouldn't make up is grace, is the idea that you could be saved through nothing that you do yourself. So we human beings, we are egotistical characters. We either believe that we're not sinners and we don't need to be saved, or there's something we can do to contribute to our salvation. And I remember being in a particularly dark time during the period that I spent as my party's leader. I felt I'd completely screwed up. Paul, my pastor, said to me, look, Tim, the reality is you have got to take this face on. For a Christian, sin spoils your relationship with God, but it doesn't end it. It doesn't end it. And that was an enormous realization in my heart, which was emotional to me at that moment, that I am saved because of his efforts and not mine. And isn't that wonderful? Because if it was up to me, I would screw it up by tea time. I'd screw it up by breakfast every single day. If it's in his hands, I'm safe and sound, I'm home and dry. And so are all of us if we're trusting in Jesus. But that is so hard to believe, because that tells you there is nothing that you can do to contribute to your own salvation. Nothing apart from the sin that made it necessary in the first place. You, if you are a Christian, if you're trusting in Jesus, you are as acceptable to Jesus, acceptable through Jesus to God on your worst day as a Christian as you are on your best. Just as acceptable. That is utterly radical. And it completely is utterly and totally counter-cultural. So you wouldn't make it up. I'm going to say that Christianity is also enormously counter-cultural. The danger in the West, and particularly in a beautiful old building like this, I go to a very ugly 1960s evangelical church in Kendal, a nice, lovely, nice church like this. We just think, and there's bishops in the House of Lords, you know, and Her Majesty is the defender of the faith, that we think of Christianity as this establishment, small c, conservative thing. It's not. It's colossally radical. It is always, always, always countercultural, because it does tell you that you are saved by grace alone. You can't merit your salvation. It tells you you have to forgive other people in the same way that you have been forgiven, which is completely against every instinct that we have. Even the worst of all sinners is capable of receiving grace and being saved and being forgiven and being redeemed. It also tells you that you're not your own. You know, you are made by a God who knit you together in your mother's womb. You are fearfully and wonderfully made. So it tells you of a God who made you and made the entire universe, and yet also knows you, every cell of your body, he put together in just the right order. I'm blown away. I listen to a lot of Tim Keller sermons because, you know, he's really interesting and I like hearing him. A story he's told at least twice in things I've heard recently is an account of him being a young man, 18 or so, on a camp. And he reflects on something, a woman who was the kind of the talk leader, if you like, at this particular session at the camp he was at with his mates. And she says, right, I want you to just imagine this thickness of this piece of paper. It's almost 2D, but the thickness of this piece of paper. And imagine that that represents the distance between the Earth and the Sun, 93 million miles, okay? That's the thickness of this little piece of paper. She said, right, on that scale, the distance between Earth and the next nearest star, Proxima Centauri, is a stack of paper 75 feet high. 75 feet high. Let's keep going. The distance from the Earth to the edge of just our galaxy, our local galaxy, the one we're in, the Milky Way, is a stack of paper 350 miles high. The galaxy, or rather our star, is one of perhaps up to between 100 and 400 billion stars just in our galaxy. And in the observable universe, there are 2 trillion galaxies. Now, God breathed all that into existence, and he holds it in the palm of his hands. You don't expect, or you don't accept and welcome that kind of a being into your life just to be your assistant. This is a sense of an awesome being that just blows your mind. We think about the glory of God. We think of the awesomeness of God, the mind-blowingness of God. And that same awesome God who holds 2 trillion galaxies in the palm of his hands knit you together in your mother's womb. You are known to him. Every hair on your head is numbered. That's awesome. Utterly, utterly, utterly awesome. And so it kind of meets, whilst it is counter to everything we want to believe, nevertheless it also meets a deep need within us. So, and I'm going to just make a couple of quick points on the science side. I'd argue that science, as Johannes Kepler said, what am I doing? I'm thinking God's thoughts after him, says Kepler. If you think about the fine-tuning available or obvious within the universe, it seems so extremely unlikely that it would have happened by accident. The best that physicists can come up with to explain away the absolute coincidental, at ludicrous odds, by the way, of the fine-tuning of the universe, that means that there is any matter that coagulates and any life possible at all. The best alternative to there being a creator is this idea of there being multiple parallel universes, and we just happen to be in the one where this one is possible. Okay, interesting theory, but I tell you what, that's a much bigger leap of faith than believing in Jesus Christ. A much bigger leap of faith. And if you believe that, I wish I had your faith. I mean, and then finally this. Look, morality. I said earlier on about, every worldview is the same, but actually we all know what is right and wrong. We talk about human rights, and many people who would be very clear in their rejection of a religious faith, in particular of Christian faith, now it's very clear that there are human rights, that it is wrong that Putin does what he does, and it is, by the way, we should call it wickedness. Christians should not be neutral on these things. So there is wickedness and there is good. Certain things are undoubtedly wrong and some things are right and they're good. On what basis do you think this? If we're just the accidental collection of atoms and cells, then the morality we have today could easily be different in a year's time, 12 months' time, 20 years' time, a millennia's time. What are these human rights you speak of? They are just temporary delusions. But they're not, are they? We know because we have built into us a morality which I'm going to argue is God created. It's not that atheists aren't moral. I know many atheists who are far more moral than many of the Christians that I know. What they're wrong about, in my view, is where their morality comes from. Because if it isn't from a God, if it isn't from a natural law, then there is no source that you can anyway claim any longevity to whatsoever. Like I say, your human rights today could be human wrongs next century. What's the point in fighting for them? So there you go. Now, I don't know whether they're good or strong arguments or not, but I can't prove to you Christianity is true. I can't. I hope I can lay out to you that it's reasonable. It's reasonable. And you are doing yourself a colossal disservice not to take it very seriously indeed. But I will finish by saying this. So I talked about how I came to faith and the books that I read and then and since. And I also said that there's a real danger in church circles, in Christian circles, that we kind of venerate the testimony and we polish it a little bit too much. I was on the church stage And it was a stage. It was a massive Pentecostal church in Manchester. And I went there. I was invited when I was party leader. And it was one of the few things that the party press office that would let me go to that was kind of God-related, because they were all very nervous about that kind of thing. And I was interviewed on the stage, and I told him pretty much what I told you about the Singapore story, which is all true. And then I remembered something else, and it is a memory. It's not a false memory. It definitely happened. So my mum, child of the 60s, and her friend Yvonne was even more a child of the 60s, and were very into all sorts of wacky things. Our house was a drop-in for lots of people. It was a little terrace house. The walls barely existed. If the cat broke wind in the cellar, you could hear it in the attic. It was, and I recall my mum's lovely, bracket slightly wacky, but lovely friend Yvonne would bring round lots of people. And I remember in particular, one night I was in bed, and I remember the voice of a guy who I never met, never seen, but whose voice I'll never forget, at least not now. And he was imploring my mum and Yvonne to ask Jesus into their hearts. And I was 9, and I was in bed, and I thought, that sounds really interesting. That sounds really important. I'm going to do that. And so I did. And I won't say I thought nothing again of it, but I clearly didn't have any way of dealing with it. And in the years, and it occurred to me when I was on that stage at this big Pentecostal church in Manchester, it occurred to me, do you know what? Maybe that was the moment, actually. Maybe that was the moment. Because there is a danger when I tell my story that this is me showing off how Christianity is a terribly clever thing that Clever Tim cleverly discovered. Rubbish. The fact is that Christianity, yes, people far wiser than me can stand on the stages of the great and debate the likes of Dawkins, and Jesus Christ's case can be made in the most intellectual, high-minded places on the planet. And he's also accessible to a 9-year-old kid who doesn't know what he's doing. He's also accessible to somebody with learning difficulties, someone with Alzheimer's. The bar is not just morally low in the sense that grace is free to absolutely everybody. It is intellectually low in one sense. Whilst able to compete at the highest level, it is also just open to simple trust. And Jesus says, let the little children come to me. That's what he means for all of us. Have a childlike faith. Will you trust me? I am the God of the universe. I hold 2 trillion galaxies in the palm of my hand. Will you trust me? Will you trust me? Stop tying yourself up in knots about your objections. Accept me. Humble yourself before me, because there is, as they say, Lewis also says that pride is the gateway sin, which is means humility is the gateway virtue. If you're prepared to accept that God is God, then you will be in a position where you might trust the one he sent to save you. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim, very much indeed. As promised, there is a chance now to stretch your legs and to fill up your glasses. So do please do that.